Texas is the energy capital. It's not the oil and gas capital. It's not the solar capital. It's energy. And one of the things we've really seen, Nico, that is so fascinating in Texas is oil and gas companies scrambling to connect to the grid for their fracking operations. Why? Not because of some ideology, because it's cheaper than running a diesel genset out in the Permian, right?
Yeah.
We're seeing this kind of permeability between the different energy companies that is really fascinating and kind of fun. All right. Welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Lewin. Today, I'm very excited to be with Nico Johnson, who is the host of SunCast, the podcast covering solar for how long now, Nico?
About a decade.
A decade, over 700, almost 800 episodes?
790, I think 792 this morning.
I mean, if there's anybody in the world that knows more about solar, I probably haven't met them yet. But we are going to talk about Texas mostly today.
Indeed.
We're going to kind of turn the tables. Nico's going to ask me some questions about Texas. And Nico, if you're okay with it, I might ask you a couple questions too, because we're recording live at Intersolar, where you've been the last 3 days talking to guests from around the industry. And I want to hear a little bit about what your takeaways from this great event are. So if that's all right, we'll do that too.
Happy to do it, my friend. I am looking forward to it. We're going to turn the tables on Doug today, since I, as a podcast host, rarely get a chance to speak as an authority on my own podcast. And so I know what it's like when your audience, doesn't get to fully appreciate your genius or your specialty, because you are so different as the host to the guest. Ideally, that's how it should be, right?
You're kind to say genius. There's probably other words a lot of people would choose, but you're kind, Nico.
Well, Doug, because I'd like to cross post this over on SunCast.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would love to give folks, even folks who are perhaps new to Energy Capital Podcast, a bit of background on how you've become a specialist on the Texas energy market, particularly, and why folks across the spectrum, especially in nonprofits, come to you for strategy around how to approach policy, how to understand it, and what the development cycle or development market looks like in Texas. So why don't you give us a little bit of background on how you've developed that expertise?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I've been working on this in this area now for 20 years. Started as a staffer at the Capitol, worked for 3 different members, both House and Senate side. And it was a really interesting era. It was 2005 to 2009. So you had like Inconvenient Truth came out. You had Governor Perry fast tracking 11 coal plants. You had the not the beginnings, kind of like, well, it was sort of maybe end of the beginning stage of the initial build out of wind in Texas. I mean, wind was really taken off during that period. You had the legislature actually expanding the renewable portfolio standard, passing in SB 20, the CREZ, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone transmission build out.
Right.
That really enabled that next wave. Energy efficiency expansion. All these things were going on during that period while I was there. And I really got bit by the bug. I was like, this is a lot of fun. This is interesting. And I was just like, this is what I'm going to do. It was just one of those things where you like knew it was going to happen. I went on to lead a nonprofit focused on energy efficiency for 5 years. And it just, basically over these last 20 years, as the ERCOT market has become more and more dynamic, and as renewables have taken off, demand side starting to get more interesting, I've just continued to just kind of double down again on this line of work.
So, Doug, I have to ask, in a market where I imagine 99.9% of your friends are in energy,
professional friends, sure, yeah,
which is right, professional friends, which is code in Texas for fossil fuels. Are you seen as a bit of an outsider in any way for that portion of your career where you really focused on energy, what has now become energy transition, energy efficiency,
right.
sort of using less fossil fuels?
It's funny, like we used to, when I was kind of starting out in this area, we would talk about solar and wind as being alternative energies, right? And like now, 90%, as a matter of fact, the governor in his State of the State address a couple weeks ago said Texas has added 35% power supply over the last 4 years. Since Winter Storm Uri, we've added 35%. And I was like,
35% in new
generations,
right.
Like 125 gigawatts, nameplate all the way up to 170. And so I was like, that's really interesting. I wonder if that's right, first of all. And it was.
Yeah.
And where that's coming from, 93% of it is wind solar storage. 75% of it is solar and storage.
Yes.
So those aren't alternatives anymore. And I say that because I think it's a way to answer that question is, there are very few people I talk to in the oil and gas industry, and I talk to a lot of them. There's very few people that sort of now view all of this as just a silo.
Right.
It's Texas is the energy capital. It's not the oil and gas capital. It's not the solar capital. It's energy. And one of the things we've really seen, Nico, that is so fascinating in Texas is oil and gas companies scrambling to connect to the grid for their fracking operations. Why? Not because of some ideology, because it's cheaper than running a diesel genset out in the Permian, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're seeing this kind of permeability between the different energy companies that is really fascinating and kind of fun.
Yeah. So the Texas market, for anybody who is unfamiliar, is an island for all purposes. From an electrical perspective, it has its own operating grid effectively. And the way that market operates is unique in many ways. It is an unregulated market. There are many folks that generate and sell power, unlike the investor-owned or regulated utilities across most of our continental United States. Could you talk about the evolution of the energy market in Texas with regards to the adoption of renewables, what the driver was? Because if for those who were paying attention to solar and battery energy storage, there was the logical, California and New York markets and some of the Midwest markets for community solar. And then around 2020, 2021, Texas very quietly and quickly became categorically the leader in new solar project development, I'll say, and then new solar project interconnections, and then seemingly overnight, battery energy storage.
Yeah.
And it feels like, to folks watching, not to those of us who were sort of seeing how it was being done, it felt to folks like, well, batteries sort of came out of nowhere. But it's like, it was a little bit of like tail wagging the dog. Can you talk about the market structure that incentivized such a quick pivot of the industry towards solar and battery energy storage?
Yeah, for sure. So, I think California, New York, and like you mentioned, the Midwest markets are kind of, they've been more policy driven. So Texas, to be clear, in the early days, it was policy driven.
Right.
It was a renewable portfolio standard in 99, expanded in 2005. But over the last 15 years, there really haven't been as many policy drivers. So I would characterize what's happening in Texas a little bit like second mouse gets the cheese. This will anger a lot of my California friends, right? They kind of overpaid for that first wave of solar. That's not fair. Like, they didn't overpay. They paid a lot because
fair.
But it was right. But it was important to stimulate a market when California did. That's a major contribution, and people in Texas, frankly, should be thankful for that. But in a sense, that second mouse gets the cheese. Like, once that cost curve had come down, and to your question about the Texas market, it is a market that is economic dispatch only. There's no like loading order.
Well, let's define that. What's economic dispatch for those who don't understand?
Economic dispatch just means the lowest cost resource is dispatched. Yep. That's all it means. And the lowest cost resource over the last several years has been wind and solar. Obviously, there's a high upfront capital cost, but once you get that on the grid, there's not a fuel cost, so they're bidding in quite low. That is having a downward pressure on prices, which is one of the reasons why a lot of manufacturers are coming to Texas, why a lot of data centers are looking at Texas. It's been really good for the economy. But what you started to see, like you said, around 2020, 2021, right in there, maybe even a little bit before, like 2018, 2019, was solar really starting to come up that curve. At the time of Uri, so very beginning of 21, we had like 6,000 megawatts of solar. We're up to about 30,000 within ERCOT now. So just a meteoric rise. In storage, you kind of saw the same thing. Uri, we had like 200 megawatts of storage, up to 10,000 now. We doubled just in 2024 from 5 to 10,000. So, and that again really kind of comes to like, the other side of that economic dispatch is when you don't have enough of the low cost resources, prices can go very, very high in the market.
Yes.
So that's a big inducement to the batteries to come.
And here, this is the secret for those who are doing project development in other markets where you don't get the kinds of incentives that you get in Texas. So I want you to unpack a little bit what developers are betting on or banking on. Traditionally, the banks would never give you financing, certainly non-recourse financing, on a project that had anything that looked like a merchant tail, anything that had market pricing risk. They wanted firm offtake. However, my understanding at least is that the majority of folks that are prospecting into the Texas market with battery energy storage and solar are considering that the merchant tail is where the upside is in the market. So could you talk a bit about the dynamic of what people are betting on in the market that makes it so appealing from a developer perspective, especially with regards to storage?
Yeah, so I think with storage, it's probably more true on the merchant side than it is on
I think
solar.
Right? I think that's right.
Solar, you'll see a lot of bilaterals and people really wanting that offtake. Certainly, there's some of that in storage, but in storage, you are looking at those high price intervals, right? A market cap of $5,000 a megawatt hour. No other market in the U.S., I think in North America, maybe Alberta, but it has higher than like 1,000, right? So that's a very, very rich incentive to bring fast acting generation because it might only last for 5 minutes, but 5 minutes at $5,000 a megawatt hour is still a lot of money. So that is a big inducement to batteries to come into the market. And then I think the other part of this,
and it's so quickly dispatchable.
Correct.
It's
correct.
Instant on.
Correct.
It's not spinning reserves. There's almost no standby cost relative to the standby cost for other types of generators.
Well, and that's the other part of this that is like really kind of amazing what's happened in Texas is the much of the ancillary service market. So that's the backup reserves, which those are pretty rich markets because you have to have those backup reserves around. Energy storage is really kind of taking them over. And in 2024, they were a lot less rich because batteries were so effective at driving prices down.
This is
so
this is a question I have for you, actually, someone who's been watching the market evolve. I said it in a podcast maybe 2 years ago. I said, here's what I think is going to happen, because arbitrage is a moment in time. It is not a market. Arbitrage in the Texas market that drove a gigantic leap in battery energy storage deployment is going to eat its own lunch, right? The question, do you see a long-term play for battery energy storage in the Texas market that looks like the kind of upside we see today, when if you flood that much batteries into the market, it has to necessarily reduce the economics?
So I do think in the very short term, we might see, I wouldn't say a slowdown, but maybe a less rapid rate of growth.
Right.
Like some of the projections out there, I think might be a little bit overheated right now, because of what you're saying, right? That 2024, ERCOT has said was the lowest priced year in the market in a decade. So out of the last 10 years, and it was, a lot of people in Texas say, oh, it wasn't so hot. And that's the reason. People in Texas say it wasn't hot in 2024. It's because 2023 was hellacious, but it was the second hottest ever, almost in a tie with 2011. But 2024 was the sixth hottest summer in recorded history. So I think you are starting to see some of that happen. But I think the counter to that is this whole phenomenon of large loads, right? Which is like, you can't, how far can you make it into any conversation? Yeah, exactly. Yep. So, and in Texas, it's a big deal.
The law of large loads. I love it.
Yeah. And it's data centers for sure.
Yeah.
But it's also, when you've covered this, the manufacturing boom in solar in Texas, right? So even like manufacturing of solar, but of all kinds of different things, the industrial electrification that's starting to happen, both in oil and gas, like we were just talking about, but even petrochemicals and refineries. We have an electric steel manufacturing facility in Texas now. One of the LNG export facilities is grid connected, 700 megawatts. So we're seeing all this load growth. And I think that's the counter to sort of solar and storage kind of eating their own lunch, cannibalizing.
So is there what research organizations do you see providing the best focus or data on this kind of sort of back-end project analysis that developers who maybe are thinking about, is there still opportunity in Texas, should be looking at? Are there free resources, paid resources that you feel like get overlooked?
I mean, there's a ton of great resources out there. One that I would highlight would be Aurora Energy Research. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they've done some fantastic studies, including one looking at, I don't know if they've analyzed the latest winter storm yet, but the winter storm in 2024, known as Heather, and they said batteries saved the market $750 million. Then they're producing a whole lot of good research that's they cover all over the place, but they have their American headquarters is in Austin, and they've got 80 people there, so they're really kind of all over the ERCOT market.
Yeah, I know them. One of our customers, Amperon, works a lot with Aurora and produces a lot of data-driven insights that I had not come across them before that.
Yeah.
Doug, because folks come to you for essentially advice, strategy, consulting on how the market's working and where it's going, I thought it'd be prudent to ask, everyone sort of looks at Texas as this perpetual motion machine, right? Like we can go there, it's going to keep growing, like we just talked about. What do you see happening on a policy level or at a local level that maybe folks outside of the market aren't necessarily seeing yet or paying attention to that could upend this whole thing?
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So there's a couple things, but I think number one, the far biggest threat is there is a bill in the Senate called Senate Bill 819, which would put into place, if it were to pass as it is drafted, probably the most restrictive, onerous permitting requirements for both wind and solar in the country. I mean, developers have really struggled in Ohio and Michigan and some other places with their permitting regimes. This, I think, from what I've heard, talking to people, would actually be worse
in a world where we need to be freeing up permitting.
and it's kind of wild too, right? Because you have this kind of this is playing out at the state level and at the federal level, right? Is this sort of like, on the one hand, if you want energy dominance, but you want to like squash renewables, like you can have one or the other, you can't have both.
Right. I mean, for us, the foregone conclusion is great. We're going to have energy dominance. We're going to focus on energy being a U.S. superpower. Then if you're going to free up, that means you implicitly are trying to remove bureaucracy for, let's face it, natural gas, fracking, and oil and gas, which, by the way, exploration, like more exploration to get to drill, baby drill. We're years away from being able to actually exploit that promise. So it's naturally going to have to come from the fracking fields, and that's naturally going to have to come from reducing bureaucracy that was put in place to help us avoid continuing to extract fossil fuels. How does that not benefit the renewables industry? Well, if the explicit instruction is also, oh, by the way, don't let renewables win.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about permitting reform, it needs to be across the board and not just sort of picking certain technologies.
Picking winners,
and really, again, I mean, that's what, like, most, I would say that, you know, the folks that are supporting 819 or more, Senate Bill 819 are more the exception of the rule. Most people in Texas, from, you know, the statewide, you know, Chamber of Commerce to oil and gas companies that want to buy renewable energy, most people understand that this is more of an all of the above energy system, and that these different energy resources complement each other.
Yeah.
I was really fascinated by, there was a report. So last session, in the 2023 session, there was a bill that required the Railroad Commission to set up a hydrogen production council and produce a report. Yeah. And their report was actually pretty good. And it said, hey, we've got all this low-cost electricity from wind and solar. Right. That may help us produce hydrogen and actually be good for the fossil fuel industry. Right. And so, you know, I think you're starting to see things like that. The Railroad Commission has never been a big cheerleader for renewable energy, but they are also starting to understand that, hey, this is a system and these things actually...
You could understand why. They transport a lot of fossil fuels.
they do, and the fossil fuel industry is really interested in hydrogen as a potential growth industry.
Yeah, I mean, I think once you understand, and this is a big transformation for me as a like someone who's kind of born and raised in the solar industry. I had not spent much time in traditional energy, and the sort of the shift in thinking for me was starting to think, well, I'm familiar with electrons. The fossil industry talks about molecules. Molecules. You knew exactly where I was going, right?
I did.
And if you can understand, well, what is not just the language, but the business model around molecules, you can quickly see which of the, I'm going to do air quotes for those who can't see us, like the renewable technologies that will allow for fewer stranded assets for the fossil fuel industry. You can see where lobby interests, et cetera, align. Things like carbon capture, things like geothermal, which I'm a huge fan of.
Sure, absolutely.
I'm curious, as a local in the Texas market, in the energy capital of the world, I've heard you use two in particular sort of keywords. We used to call it alternative power. Yeah. You just said renewable energy. In Texas right now, what is, solar, wind, the clean energy spectrum? How's it referred to? Are there any sort of key words that...
I mean, people talk about it all kinds of different ways. You hear all kinds of different language, but I think at this point, like, clean energy is just energy
clean
at this
energy.
point. Like, it's just that last year on the grid, we were about 45% carbon free, about 35% renewable, 10% nuclear in Texas. So, I mean, at this point, like, it is a misnomer to call it alternative. I think people still refer to it as renewable energy. When I say, like, it's no longer alternative, like, gas, as far as new capacity, gas is a little bit of an alternative energy right now, right? So, I mean, it just kind of is, right? It takes longer. It's more expensive. You really, like, the state is actually, Texas is actually trying to subsidize new gas plants. Like, it's just the speed and scale and cost of solar and storage is just so dominant, to use that phrase, right? Like, that is what's being deployed.
I had a really interesting conversation with the guy who runs the predominant think tank for the propane industry. I had him on the show, and it was entirely because he proffers a word that I disagree with fundamentally, and that is, well, of a phrase, renewable natural gas. And so I had him on to sort of go back and forth and have a conversation about the reality of renewable natural gas. Are there phrases like that you also hear where the industry, you see it sort of adopting this language that is effectively, and where I want to go with this is actually, like, I think that there is no us versus them. I've said this since 2020. I'm like, guys, we can't have a fight with oil and gas. Like, in case you haven't noticed, two of the largest solar developers in the United States, actually much more than that, but we'll just focus on LightSource and Silicon Ranch. Their majority investors are oil and gas companies, right? And if you go look at Energy Toolbase, you look at FracSun, I can name a dozen companies off the top of my head where the private equity money behind them is oil and gas. Like, there is no us versus them. It's only us figuring out our energy future. How do you see the vernacular evolving? And we talk about this a lot here because, like, we're considered a solar podcast, but I say we're a clean energy podcast because we can't actually have solar without batteries. Texas is the perfect example of that.
Yeah. So, you were talking earlier about molecules and electrons, right? So, like, today, something like of global energy use, 80% is molecules, 20% is electrons. IEA thinks to get to net zero by 2050, it's going to be like 50-50. There's still going to be a whole lot of molecules out there.
Yes, that's
right.
And
they need to be as clean of molecules as possible, right? And so and the balance sheets, the engineering expertise, the financial expertise of oil and gas companies is going to be needed in the transition. It just is. I just don't think we can reach the speed or scale without it. You mentioned geothermal. That's a perfect example, right? I mean, they're drilling. They're literally, like, drilling and in some cases fracking to try to get heat out of the ground. And you have seen, Schlumberger, which is now SLB, and like all these different oil and gas, oil field services companies, even Halliburton companies like that, getting into geothermal. So this is, I agree with you. I think that if it is us versus them, it's possible that we could decarbonize. It's going to be a hell of a lot harder, slower, more painful. This really needs to be everybody kind of pulling together. Yeah. And I think that I think my experience with folks in the oil and gas industry is they are, to put a word on it, pragmatic.
Yes, that's right.
And they see the opportunities in clean energy and in this transition. A lot of them, I'll tell you about vernacular. One of the things I hear a lot in Texas is energy expansion.
Oh, there you go.
Some people don't like energy transition, though. Like the Greater Houston Partnership, the chamber for the Houston area, they talk about the Houston Energy Transition. They call it the Houston Energy Transition Initiative. But a lot of other folks get sort of spooked by those words. They talk about energy expansion. And I'm kind of like, whatever words you want to use, as long as we're talking about making energy more abundant and affordable, safe, reliable, and clean. Yeah. All of those things. They're all important goals. We got to balance them, but they're all important.
I love it. Expansion is a great molecule word.
Can I ask you a quick question? I know right. So you have been talking to people the last couple of days here. Is there something you can share with the listeners that and I know this is hard. It's like asking you to pick which of your children is your favorite, but like something you're really excited about right now. Within the solar industry, could be utility side, could be distributed side, could be a new technology.
Yeah, there's two things, and I'll give you some stories around it. So when I started in this industry, 2006, companies like BP, Mitsubishi, Shell, Schott were global name brand manufacturing organizations with factories here in the U.S.
Yeah,
we were buying. We're building and buying panels in Maryland, in Mississippi, in Oregon. And I watched in the course of 6 of the first years I was in this industry, that industry wither away as we had tacit handshake with Asia to produce it at a lower cost. And by the way, there was a very intentional, very strategic government decision in China specifically to throw as much money at the technology problem as possible to get the technology to the place where it would become economically viable. Through a series of administrations now, we've seen an increasing call for domestic manufacturing, something that I never thought I would see in my career again on U.S. soil. I called BS on it the first time I saw it. I was like, this is never going to make financial sense.
When was that? When
2019, 2020.
Okay.
And I was like, this is never going to make any sense. Back in the first Trump administration, I was like, this is never going to happen.
China's just going to outcompete us because it's just too dominant.
And I was wrong. And as I have watched now, when I first came in the industry and was working at Trina, and like just had one of the leaders of one of the largest solar manufacturers in the world on our stage, and another gentleman that he and I worked with is running another, one of their competitors. I've watched my friends become owners and managers of these large module manufacturing businesses, and I've gone to them and said, help me understand the economics. Is this durable? Like, I've asked them on our podcast, please explain to me why this is not another flash in the pan. Please explain to the American people why this is going to be here for 10, 20, 30 years. And they have solid answers. Mark Sokolov at Q-Cells has a solid answer for why Q-Cells is going to be around, why they're not just going to be around, but why they're doubling down on further vertically integrating on U.S. soil.
And is that policy? Is it economics? Is it the technology? What is it? All that?
It is. So I think it's a change in the tide of the sentiment of the buyers. One, and it is a realignment of policy, like what we've seen in various iterations in the past at a state level to compete on a regional basis. Like, how are we going to attract tax dollars, tax revenue? How are we going to attract jobs? And it's all built in almost entirely on the back of this desire for jobs at a local level to revive the Rust Belt, to bring jobs back to the South, and to restore. I'll use the word for the current to restore dominance globally of the American brand. So I think it's at least 10, 15 years durable, which actually is fine. That's a great cycle.
Powerful.
That's a great cycle for our industry. So I sat down yesterday with a major Asian battery manufacturer, and I said they want to work with us and advertise on our platform. And I said, look, what's your domestic plan? Crickets. I pressed and I said, how are people going to buy domestic content from this company? You are a world leader, well established. They want to buy from you. You're the market leader in adjacent countries. Oh, well, we have a JV in Europe and we're going to sell through that. And I was like, I hate to burst your bubble, but not only are you not going to be able to advertise on our platform, but I don't want to waste that money just to take it for self-preservation when I know that in the end, you're going to get 0 orders because your answer is we don't have a domestic plan. And every buyer now is going to require you to have a domestic plan because that's the plan. And if you don't have a domestic plan, I'm not going to allow my reputation to be on the line for my listeners to go, why is Nico sort of lobbying for this brand that is not committing to our local economy? Right. And it's that it is. So we are seeing this globally, this resurgence of domestic, that sort of reshoring. Right. And this domestic supply.
I think it's really fascinating because it is a convergence of the clean energy industry and a major part of what Trump and the Republican Party seem to really want right now, this energy dominance, America first. It's like we should be making things here in the United States. And so maybe there's this weird sort of like left and right, like meeting up. And it's going to be fascinating to see what happens with so many parts of the IRA, but like 45X, right? The manufacturing incentives. How do you take those away when you're building factories?
I've on good authority from more than a handful of sources that 45X seems very secure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'd be hard to imagine a bunch of folks voting against their district.
Cannot.
Factories out of their districts
right.
that are being built right there right now.
And then the second is I've been sort of informally and through this show formally polling what sector is finally poised for growth. What do you think it is? Let's just focus on the solar industry.
Within the solar industry, which sector is posed?
Solar industry is traditionally sort of broken into 3.5, 4 sectors, like resi, commercial, utility, community solar.
I mean, so I always think about Texas, right? So sorry to be annoying and give you the Texas answer, but I actually think there's a huge amount of growth that will likely happen on the more distributed side, residential, but also some, whether you call it community solar or just like there's a certain level of interconnection if you're above 10 megawatts. So if you can do 9.9s at congested areas around, I think we're going to see a lot of that. And Texas is, while we've been great on the utility scale side and 30 gigawatts, and that's awesome, we're way behind on the distributed side.
Not just Texas, the rest of the country as well.
Yeah.
So as long as I've been in the solar industry, I sold what was at the time the first 100% solar-powered newspaper in the country, the Monterey County Weekly, in 2006.
Amazing.
33 kilowatts. Okay, so like
kilowatts.
all these people will tell you I sold the first X. It was peanuts compared to what we're doing today. But I've watched the commercial sector be the next big sector for 18, 19 years that I've been in the industry. It is inevitable that code will get cracked. And I think that 2025 will be the tipping point, what I'm seeing, and I'll call it here. I think that 2025 is going to be the first year where we actually see distributed generation, in particular focused on commercial, industrial, large-scale rooftops.
Yes.
Not resi. I think resi is going to continue to suffer. I'm sorry to hear you say that.
Okay.
It'll be the first time that we see the C&I sector at scale, see a tipping point, and start a run towards velocity in that market that we've not experienced in the last 20 years. And I see it in companies like, I just had Jorge Vargas from Aspen Power, the guys from Encore Renewables, Chad, those guys up in Vermont, like the Northeast in particular, are a great bellwether for what's happening. There's a flight to quality with capital, but there is an enormous amount of capital funneling into the distributed energy market.
Very interesting.
And I'm very bullish on the distributed energy market, in particular large-scale rooftops.
I'll just say one more thing. I think there's good market reasons to put distributed energy. You look at Houston, something like 60 to 70% of the power coming into Houston is coming in from other parts of the state. Obviously, ERCOT's this closed system, but it's coming in from West Texas. There are constraints along the transmission line. So putting generation locally makes a ton of sense. The other sort of important thing in Texas, I mentioned earlier that the state was subsidizing large gas plants. Part of that bill was putting $1.8 billion towards microgrids that the law mandates must be a mix of solar storage and gas at critical facilities like hospitals, water treatment plants. You think of Winter Storm Uri, like what kind of infrastructure do you absolutely need to have? Like not even 5 nines, but just like 100%
totally
uptime, right? Hospitals, nursing homes, water treatment facilities, police stations, fire departments. So those kinds of that $1.8 billion it's a $500,000 a megawatt subsidy specifically for these microgrids at critical facilities, backup power packages, they call it, maybe not technically microgrids. But I think that's going to be a big inducement to distributed solar. That's a really interesting.
I completely agree with you. And I'll note that microgrid for me is a subset of distributed generation, particularly the C&I sector. And you'll hear a lot of buzz around microgrid this year. One of the big sponsors for Intersolar here is this company Zendi right here in San Diego. They've basically become the de facto sort of operating software for determining what a microgrid should look like. And this blending of the various forms of energy generation, the various loads at a local level has, like, microgrids are not a new thing, right? Submarines, a microgrid. We've been powering microgrids with renewable energy for a long time.
Sure. Yeah.
And I completely agree with you. I didn't know that about Texas, and that's one of the reasons I'm really glad to have this conversation with you. Is there are pockets in the United States right now that are investing big time into microgrids, and it's as a subset. It is effectively distributed generation. It is a local load, and it is a very local problem to solve. It's not going to be solved by major national companies like Honeywell. They will invest in it, right? They'll be there, but it's going to be solved at a local level. And that's one of the things I'm also really bullish about, is that we're going to see a return, instead of major national brands, to local and maybe even super regional brands that dominate the industry moving forward in the next 2 or 3 years.
Very interesting. Lot to watch for, a lot to be excited and interested about. And I'll just say, kind of in closing, Nico, I really appreciate you making the space available. We're, like, as you said, we're here at Intersolar. There's going to be an Intersolar later in 2025 in Texas.
That's right.
I don't know if you're coming. I hope you will, because there's great, because there's so much happening in Texas, and I'm really glad Intersolar did one in Austin last year. They'll be in the DFW area next year. It's a great event, and I encourage people to mark their calendars for November 2025 for Intersolar.
And Grapevine.
Yeah, Grapevine. There you go.
Well, I have enjoyed co-hosting the Energy Capital podcast with you today.
Thanks, Steve.
Really a lot of fun. I look forward to it. Have you back, hopefully, do more collaboration in the future, and have you on our SunCast podcast,
let's
talking more about Texas specifics, because we got to help folks know where to point their resources, and this is one of the ways we do it.
Anytime, just ask, I'll be there. You do a great job covering the solar industry. There's nobody better. So thanks so much, Nico. Appreciate it, man.